The first person to choose Abigail Whittaker on her wedding day was not her groom, not the preacher, and not a single soul from the town that had gathered to watch her fall. It was a little girl who had not spoken a word in 2 years. Abby stood in the mud outside the white church of Mercy Creek with rain slipping from the brim of her bonnet and soaking the shoulders of the wedding dress she had sewn by hand through 12 lonely nights. The hem, once clean and bright, dragged brown around her ankles. One glove was missing. The other clung wet to her fingers as she stared at the small gold ring Preston Vale had dropped into the road like it was no better than a bent nail. "I won't do it," Preston said, loud enough for the church steps, the hitching rail, and half the county to hear. He was dressed fine in a black coat, his boots polished so clean the mud seemed afraid to touch him. "I won't marry a woman the whole town is already laughing at." No one moved. A wagon horse snorted. Rain ticked against the church windows. Somewhere behind Abby, a woman whispered, "Poor thing. Built too big for a white dress." Abby heard it. Of course she heard it. She had heard words like that all her life, sometimes dressed in pity, sometimes dressed in scripture, sometimes served cold across a supper table by people who thought cruelty became harmless if spoken softly. But this time the words landed in front of a church, on the day she had promised herself she would finally belong somewhere. Her fair cheeks burned beneath the rain. She bent to pick up the ring, not because she wanted it, but because leaving it there felt like letting Preston decide what she was worth. Her fingers shook before they reached the mud. The dress pulled tight at her knees. Someone chuckled. Abby froze with her hand halfway down, and for one terrible second, she thought she might not be able to rise again with all those eyes pinned to her back. Then the crowd parted without meaning to. A small girl in a faded blue coat stepped down from a freight wagon near the general store. She was thin as a willow switch, with pale hair tucked under a knitted cap and solemn gray eyes that seemed too old for her face. Lily Mercer. Everybody in Mercy Creek knew Lily Mercer, the silent daughter of Caleb Mercer from the North Ridge Ranch. They knew her mother had died 2 winters ago. They knew Caleb brought the child to town only when he had to. They knew she never spoke, not to the schoolmistress, not to the doctor, not even to the church ladies who bent low and sweetened their voices until sweetness turned sour. Caleb Mercer stood by the wagon wheel, one gloved hand resting on the sideboard, his hat brim shadowing most of his face. He saw his daughter move, and his shoulders went still. "Lily," he said. The girl did not stop. She crossed the muddy road in front of the whole town, her little boots sinking with each step, and stopped beside Abby. Preston made a sound under his breath, half laugh, half annoyance. "Best keep your child out of this, Mercer." Caleb did not answer. Abby looked down, rain caught on her lashes, and found Lily staring not at the ruined dress, not at her wide hips, not at the mud on her knees, but straight into her face, as if she saw a person standing there when nobody else could. Lily bent, picked up the ring, wiped it once against her own coat, and placed it in Abby's trembling palm. Then she slipped her small hand into Abby's muddy glove and held on. The churchyard went quiet in a way Abby had never heard quiet before. Not peaceful. Not kind. A stunned kind of quiet, sharp as a held breath. Preston's smile thinned. "Well," he said, trying to make his voice light, "seems the child has poor taste too." Caleb Mercer stepped away from the wagon. He did not hurry. Men like him did not need to hurry to make the air change. He was tall, broad from ranch work, his coat dark with rain, his jaw set like a fence post driven deep into frozen ground. "Lily," he said again, softer this time. "Let go." Lily's fingers tightened around Abby's hand. Abby swallowed. "It's all right," she whispered to the child. "You don't have to stand with me." But Lily did not look away, and she did not let go. Caleb stopped 3 feet from them, close enough that Abby could see the rain on his beard and the old grief sitting in his eyes like winter that had never fully thawed. He looked at his daughter's hand in Abby's. Then he looked at Preston Vale, clean boots, clean coat, clean cowardice. Finally, he took off his own coat and placed it around Abby's shoulders without touching more than the wet fabric of her sleeve. "A woman standing in the mud," Caleb said, his voice low enough to make the front row lean in, "still deserves more respect than a man walking away clean." Abby's breath caught. Preston's face darkened, but he said nothing. No one did. Caleb turned back to Abby, not gentle exactly, but careful. "Ma'am, my wagon's dry enough. My ranch is 7 miles out. You can ride as far as the rain lets you." Abby should have refused. Pride rose in her throat, hot and bruised. She had been left once already that morning, and she would not be carried off like another burden nobody wanted. But before she could speak, Lily rested her forehead against Abby's arm, as if she had been tired for a very long time and had finally found a place to lean. Caleb saw it. So did the town. And Abby, standing in the mud with a stranger's coat on her shoulders and a silent child holding her hand, understood that something had just begun that no groom, no gossip, and no churchyard full of watching eyes could stop. Caleb Mercer did not look at the crowd when he lifted Lily into the wagon. He looked only at his daughter, then at the muddy hand she refused to pull away from Abigail Whittaker. "Let go, Lily," he said, and the words came out with the tired patience of a man who had said them to storms, debts, sick horses, and grief, and had never once been answered kindly. Lily did not let go. She climbed onto the wagon bench with one hand still wrapped around Abby's glove, then turned and reached for her again as if the choice had already been made and the grown people were simply slow to understand it. Abby stood at the edge of the road, Caleb's coat heavy on her shoulders, rain running from the curls near her cheeks. "Mr. Mercer," she said quietly, "I cannot take your wagon. I cannot take your coat. I cannot take your child into my shame." Caleb's eyes moved over her face, not cruelly, not softly, just steady. Shame is not something a decent person leaves on another person's dress. Behind them, Preston Vale gave a short laugh. "That is mighty noble, Mercer. You always did have a fondness for broken things. Take her if you want. She is already dressed for pity." Abby's fingers closed around the wet ring in her palm until the small circle bit into her skin. Caleb turned his head just enough to look at Preston. He did not raise his voice. He did not step forward. He only said, "Mind your words, Vale. A man can lose more standing in one sentence than he gains in a lifetime of polished boots." The churchyard seemed to shrink around that sentence. Preston's mouth opened, then shut again. Caleb held out one hand to Abby. He did not grab. He waited. That waiting nearly undid her. Most people had pushed, pulled, corrected, measured, or dismissed her. Very few had waited for her to decide. Abby looked at his hand, then at Lily, whose gray eyes were fixed on her with a faith so simple it hurt. "I do not need saving," Abby whispered. "Good," Caleb said. "Then climb up on your own and I will drive." Her chin lifted at that. It was a small thing, but small things had kept her alive before. A clean apron, a paid bill, a loaf that rose properly, a morning when no one laughed. She gathered the ruined wedding dress in both hands and stepped toward the wagon. The mud tried to keep her. Her shoes sank deep, and the church women behind her rustled like dry leaves. Abby pulled once, failed, then pulled again. Caleb shifted as if to help, but stopped when she looked at him. On the third try, her foot came free with a wet sound, and she climbed onto the wagon without anyone lifting her. Lily immediately pressed close to her side. Abby sat stiff as a fence rail, afraid to breathe on the child, afraid to want the comfort of that small shoulder against her arm. Caleb climbed up, gathered the reins, and clicked to the horses. The wagon rolled forward through Mercy Creek, past the mercantile, past the church steps, past the faces that had watched her fall and would now watch her leave. Abby kept her eyes on the road. Ahead. She did not give Preston one last look. Rain softened the town behind them into gray shapes and window light. For nearly a mile, no one spoke. The only sounds were the wheels in the mud, the horses breathing, and the steady patter of rain on the canvas cover. Then Lily leaned her head against Abby's arm. Abby went still. Caleb noticed. His hands tightened around the reins, but he said nothing. Another mile passed. The child's weight grew heavier, warmer. Abby looked down and saw Lily's eyes closed, her lashes dark against her pale cheeks, one hand curled in the damp fold of Abby's dress. "Is she asleep?" Abby asked, barely above a whisper. Caleb did not answer right away. The road bent north toward the open land, where the town ended and the Wyoming sky spread wide and solemn over the ridges. At last he said, "She has not slept beside anyone but me since her mother passed." Abby looked out at the rain-blurred prairie, and something in her chest twisted with fear, gratitude, and a tenderness she had no right to feel. Caleb kept his gaze on the road. "Mercer Ranch is 7 miles out. You can dry off there, eat something, and decide where you mean to go after that." Abby nodded, though she had nowhere to go. Lily slept on, holding to her as if the whole world had narrowed down to one muddy dress and one hand that had not pulled away. Mercer Ranch appeared through the rain like a place that had learned how to stand without being alive. The house sat low against the north ridge, gray boards weathered by wind, porch steps dark with water, one lantern burning in the front window as if someone had lit it out of habit and forgotten why light mattered. Caleb stopped the wagon beside the porch and climbed down first. He reached for Lily, but she stirred against Abby and opened her eyes without lifting her head. For a moment, the child looked confused, as if waking beside a stranger should have frightened her. Then her fingers tightened in Abby's dress and she settled again. Caleb saw it. His jaw moved once. He said nothing. Abby gathered the heavy skirt in both hands and stepped down carefully, her shoes still wet, her legs stiff from the ride. She nearly apologized for the mud before remembering that the whole day had already taken enough from her. Caleb carried one sack of supplies inside and held the door open. The house smelled of cold ashes, pine soap, and old silence. Not neglect. Everything was swept, stacked, repaired, and plain. But there was no softness in it. No ribbon on a curtain, no bread cooling on the table, no flowers in a jar, no little messes that proved people had laughed there. The kitchen stove was black and empty. 2 plates sat on a shelf. A third, smaller plate rested upside down as if it had not been used in a long time. Lily moved straight to the stairs and stopped halfway up, still watching Abby. Caleb set the supplies down. "You can sleep in the back room by the kitchen," he said. "It is dry. There is a quilt on the chair." Abby nodded. "Thank you. I will be gone in the morning." "That is best." The words were not cruel, but they landed hard. Caleb took off his hat, rain dripping from the brim to the floorboards. "I am not looking for trouble, Mrs. Whitaker." "Miss Whitaker," she said. Her voice stayed quiet. There was no wedding. Something flickered across his face, there and gone. "Miss Whitaker, then. You sleep here tonight. You eat breakfast if you want it. After that, I can drive you back toward town or to the stage road." Abby looked toward Lily. The child had not moved. "And your daughter?" Caleb followed her gaze. "My daughter is not your worry." Lily's face changed so slightly that most people would have missed it. Abby did not. Caleb added, lower, "Do not try to mother her. Do not ask her to speak. Do not pity her. Folks have done enough of that." Abby swallowed, then nodded. "I know the difference between pity and kindness, Mr. Mercer." He looked at her then, truly looked, and for a breath the kitchen seemed smaller. "Do you? I learned it today in the rain." Caleb turned away first. "There is water in the basin. I will tend the horses." When he stepped back outside, Abby stood alone in the kitchen except for Lily on the stairs. The little girl's sleeve had torn near the cuff, a neat split in faded blue cloth. Abby noticed it because noticing small damage was easier than noticing her own. "That sleeve will catch on something," she said softly. Lily glanced down. Abby lifted both hands, palms open. "Only if you want me to fix it." Lily did not come down. She did not run either. After a long moment, she slipped the coat from her shoulders and laid it on the bottom step, then retreated halfway up again. Abby understood. She took the coat, found her little sewing roll in the pocket of her ruined dress, and sat at the kitchen table. The thread inside was wet and tangled, so she drew a clean strand from the inner seam of her wedding gown, white against her fingers, bright as a promise that had failed but not vanished. She stitched by lantern light while Lily watched from the stairs. The house made small night sounds around them. Wind at the eaves. Rain in the barrel. Caleb's boots crossing the porch and stopping when he saw them through the window. He did not come in right away. Abby finished the cuff, folded the coat, and placed it back on the step. "There," she whispered. "Good as it can be." Lily came down after Caleb had gone to the barn again. She took the coat, pressed the mended sleeve between her fingers, and looked at the white thread as if Abby had sewn a secret into it. Then she disappeared upstairs. Abby slept little that night. She lay in the back room under a quilt that smelled faintly of cedar and stared at the dark, listening to a house that did not trust warmth yet. Near dawn, she rose, smoothed Caleb's coat over the chair, and opened her door to leave before anyone had to send her away. Something waited on the floor outside her room. A small cloth doll with yarn hair, worn thin from years of holding, sat upright against the threshold. Abby bent slowly and picked it up. Around the doll's wrist was a single strand of white thread from Lily's mended sleeve. Abby stood in the gray edge of morning with Lily's doll in her hands and the whole quiet house waiting around her. She had meant to leave before Caleb woke, before the child came downstairs, before kindness had time to become something harder to walk away from. But the little doll sat warm from memory, its yarn hair rubbed soft, its tiny stitched mouth no wider than a grain of wheat, and Abby knew a child did not leave such a thing by accident. She carried it to the kitchen table and placed it carefully beside the small upside-down plate. The stove was cold, but the wood box was full. The flour sack Caleb had brought from town leaned against the pantry wall. There were apples in a crate, a crock of butter, coffee, salt pork, and a jar of sorghum pushed far back on the shelf. Not much, but enough. Abby tied her damp hair behind her neck, took one last look toward the road beyond the window, and whispered, "I will pay for one night with one breakfast." She built the fire low and patient, coaxing flame from kindling until the stove began to breathe heat into the room. She mixed biscuit dough in a chipped blue bowl, working the flour with light fingers, careful not to make too much noise. The dress she had worn to be married hung over the back of a chair, drying in uneven patches, its hem still stained from Mercy Creek mud. Abby did not look at it long. She rolled the dough, cut it with the rim of a tin cup, and set the biscuits close together in a pan so they would rise soft at the sides. Soon the kitchen changed. Butter warmed. Coffee darkened. Apples hissed gently in a skillet with sorghum and a pinch of salt. The air filled with a sweetness that did not belong to sorrow. Caleb came in from the barn just as Abby was pulling the first pan from the oven. He stopped in the doorway with his hat in his hand. His hair was damp from rain, his sleeves rolled, his boots muddy from morning chores. He looked at the stove, then at the table, then at Abby. "You were leaving," he said. "I was," Abby answered. "Then I found company at my door." She nodded toward the doll. Caleb's eyes moved to it, and something tightened in his face. "That is Rose." "Rose? My wife made it." Abby stilled. "I did not know. Lily does not let anyone touch it." Neither of them spoke after that. The biscuits sat steaming between them like a question neither one knew how to ask. From the stairs came the softest sound of bare feet on wood. Lily appeared in her blue dress, hair loose down her back, eyes fixed not on Caleb, not on the stove, but on the doll beside the plate. Abby stepped back at once. "I kept her safe," she said. Lily came down slowly. Caleb set his hat on the peg and watched with the stillness of a man afraid movement might break whatever was happening. Lily picked up the doll, held it to her chest, then looked at the table. Abby had turned the small plate right side up. On it sat one biscuit split open, butter melting into the middle, with 3 soft pieces of apple beside it. "You do not have to eat," Abby said gently. "It is only there in case your stomach asks before your mouth does." Caleb looked down at the floor, his jaw working. Lily climbed into the chair. She touched the biscuit first with one finger, testing the heat. Then she took a bite. Caleb's hand closed around the back of the nearest chair. The wood creaked under his grip. Lily chewed slowly, swallowed, and reached for another piece. Abby turned toward the stove so the child would not feel watched, but she could see Caleb in the window glass. He looked as if someone had opened a door inside him that he had nailed shut 2 winters ago. "She usually eats later," he said, rough and low. Abby poured coffee into a cup and set it near his hand. Maybe later was too lonely. Caleb looked at her then. Not like a stranger pulled from town mud. Not like trouble. Like a woman who had seen something he had missed inside his own home. Lily finished half the biscuit, then slid down from the chair. She dipped one finger into a dusting of flour on the table and slowly wrote 4 crooked letters across the wood. Stay. Abby forgot how to breathe. Caleb saw the word. Lily pressed her little palm flat beside it, as if signing her name to a wish. Outside, the rain stopped at last, but no one in that kitchen moved toward the door. Caleb stood over the word Lily had written in flour until the morning light shifted across the table and softened the edges of each crooked letter. Abby did not reach to wipe it away. Neither did he. Lily had already carried Rose to the window seat and tucked the doll beneath her chin, watching them with quiet eyes that seemed to understand more than either adult wanted spoken. Abby folded her hands in front of her apron, though it was not truly an apron, only a square of flour sack tied around the waist of a dress never meant for kitchen work. "Mr. Mercer," she said, "a child can want a thing that is not wise." Caleb looked at the flour letters again. "So can a grown man." The words startled them both. His face closed almost as soon as he said them, and he reached for his coffee like a man taking hold of something solid. "I can pay fair wages," he said. "Not much at first. The ranch has been thin since winter, but there is work enough if you want it. Cooking, washing, some mending. Nothing more than that." Abby heard the fence he built around the offer, post by post. Work, not charity. Wages, not pity. Nothing more, because more was dangerous for a house still carrying a dead woman in its corners. "I can work," she said. "I know. And I will not be kept here because folks in town made me small." Caleb lifted his eyes. "No one keeps you here. You leave when you choose." Lily's small hand pressed against the flower word again, leaving a pale print beside it. Abby looked at that hand and felt her answer form before pride could stop it. "Then I will stay for a week." Caleb nodded once. A week. By noon, the wedding dress was gone from the chair. Abby had washed it, folded it, and put it in the bottom drawer of the back room where it could not stare at her while she worked. Caleb found an old brown skirt and 2 plain blouses in a cedar trunk, things that had belonged to his sister before she married and moved east. He left them folded outside Abby's door without comment. She put them on, tied a real apron over her waist, and stepped into the kitchen looking less like a woman abandoned by a groom and more like someone who had a task before her. The house noticed first. The stove stayed warm past breakfast. Curtains came down and were shaken clean on the porch rail. The small plate remained on the table. By evening there was stew, coffee, and biscuits enough for Caleb, Lily, and 2 ranch hands who had ridden in from the south pasture expecting nothing more than cold beans. One of them, a red-haired young man named Jonah Pike, took a bite and went silent. "Ma'am," he said after a moment, "I believe this is the first supper in this house that has tasted like it wanted us alive." Caleb gave him a look. Jonah ducked his head and ate faster. Lily sat closer to Abby than to her father, not touching, but near enough that her sleeve brushed Abby's apron when she reached for her cup. Every time it happened, Caleb saw it. Every time, he looked away. The week did not pass like a week. It passed in small repairs. Abby mended a tear in Caleb's work shirt and left it folded on the bench. She found Lily's hair ribbons in a cracked jar and tied one loosely around the handle of Rose's basket. She learned that Caleb liked his coffee strong enough to complain about and drank 2 cups before sunrise. She learned that Lily hated boiled carrots, but would eat them roasted with salt. She learned which floorboard complained outside Caleb's room and which window rattled before wind came from the west. Caleb learned things too, though he would not have named them. He learned that Abby hummed only when she forgot anyone could hear. He learned that she never took the largest biscuit. He learned that when a ranch hand thanked her, her shoulders lifted first, as if bracing for mockery, then slowly settled when none came. On the 6th evening, Jonah returned from Mercy Creek with salt, lamp oil, and a face too careful to be innocent. Abby knew before he spoke that he had brought something besides supplies. Caleb knew it too. "Say it," Caleb said. Jonah shifted his hat between both hands. Vale was talking at the mercantile. Abby kept stirring the gravy. The spoon scraped once against the pan, then steadied. Jonah looked miserable. "He said Miss Whitaker ran after your wagon like a starving dog because no decent man would have her." The kitchen went so still that the stove seemed loud. Abby did not turn around. She only set the spoon down, wiped her hands on her apron, and looked at Lily, whose face had gone pale with a child's helpless anger. Abby forced a small smile for her. "Supper is ready," she said softly. Cruel words do not get a plate at this table. Caleb rose from his chair, slow and controlled. "Jonah, eat." "Boss?" "Eat," Caleb repeated, his voice quiet as snowfall. Then he looked at Abby, and this time he did not look away. "Tomorrow, I ride into town." Abby's hands folded against the apron. "Not for me." Caleb held her gaze. "For the truth." By morning, Caleb did not have to ride into town because Mercy Creek came to him first. The sound reached the kitchen before the riders did, 2 horses on the north road and wagon wheels cutting through dried mud left from yesterday's rain. Abby was kneading dough at the table with flour on her wrists when Lily looked up from the window seat and went very still. Caleb crossed to the front door without taking his coat from the peg. Jonah stepped in from the yard, face tight. "Sheriff is coming up the drive," he said. "Vale is with him." Abby's hands stopped inside the dough. For one strange second, the kitchen remained warm and ordinary around her, coffee steaming, stove ticking, Lily's small plate waiting by the cup, and then the world outside reached through the walls and tried to pull her back into the mud. Caleb opened the door before anyone knocked. Sheriff Daniel Hargrove stood on the porch with his hat in both hands, looking less like law and more like a man wishing the road had taken him elsewhere. Preston Vale stood beside him in a gray town coat, clean as Sunday, his smile arranged carefully for witnesses. "Mercer," Preston said. "Miss Whitaker." Abby wiped her hands on her apron and stepped into the doorway behind Caleb. She saw Preston's eyes move over the apron, the plain brown skirt, the flower at her wrist. His smile sharpened. "Settled and quick, I see." Caleb's voice stayed flat. "Say what you came to say." The sheriff cleared his throat. "There is a matter of record. The marriage license filed in town carries Mr. Vale's name and Miss Whitaker's. Since the ceremony did not conclude, the judge needs both parties present to void it proper." Abby felt her stomach drop, but she kept her shoulders square. "Then send word when the judge is ready." Preston took one step forward. Caleb's hand shifted on the doorframe, not threatening, only present. Preston noticed and stopped. "That is not all," Preston said. "There is the question of reputation. Mine, mostly. A man cannot be left standing with his name dragged because a woman caused a scene and ran off in another man's wagon." Abby almost laughed at the size of the lie. The sound rose in her chest, dry and bright, but Lily stood behind her now, close enough that Abby felt the child's sleeve brush her skirt. So Abby swallowed the laugh and gave Preston the truth instead. "You left me in the road." Preston's expression chilled. "Careful." "No," Abby said, and the word surprised even her. It was not loud. It did not need to be. "I have been careful all my life, Mr. Vale. Careful not to take too much room. Careful not to ask for too much bread. Careful not to wear a dress that made other people uncomfortable looking at me. Yesterday I was careful until you made my shame public. I am finished being careful with lies." The sheriff looked down at his boots. Preston's face colored, but his voice stayed smooth. "Court will decide what happened." Caleb turned toward Abby. "You do not have to stand in front of those people again." The sentence was kind, and because it was kind, it almost broke her. Abby looked past him into the house. She saw the table where Lily had written "Stay in flour." She saw the stove she had warmed with her own hands. She saw the drawer where the wedding dress lay folded, stained at the hem but not ruined. Then she looked back at Preston. "Yes," she said. "I do." Caleb's brow tightened. "Abby." It was the first time he had used her name without formality. She felt it, but she did not turn from Preston. "I was left in mud once. I will not spend my life there." Silence moved across the porch. Even the horses seemed to wait. The sheriff nodded slowly. "Judge will hear it tomorrow at 10 in the morning." Preston smiled again, but it did not reach his eyes. "Wear something decent, Miss Whitaker. The town already has enough to talk about." Lily stepped around Abby before anyone could stop her. She did not speak. She only stared at Preston with those solemn gray eyes until his smile thinned and he looked away first. After the riders left, Caleb shut the door gently, as if a hard sound might shatter the room. Abby went to the drawer in the back room and took out the wedding dress. Her fingers moved over the dried stain along the hem. She did not cry. She found her sewing scissors, cut a clean square from the inner lining, and laid it on the table. "For court?" Caleb asked. "For remembering what was stepped on," Abby said. That evening, while Abby packed the square away, Lily slipped into the room, took the folded piece of white cloth, and tucked it inside her little blue coat where her heart would be. The courthouse in Mercy Creek smelled of damp wool, floor polish, and old paper. By 10 in the morning, every bench was full. Abby had expected faces, but not so many of them, not the same church women leaning close to one another, not the storekeeper pretending to sort receipts in his lap, not the men from the livery standing along the back wall with their hats held low. She entered between Caleb and Lily, wearing the plain brown skirt from Mercer Ranch and a clean white blouse she had washed twice before sunrise. Her wedding dress was not on her body, but a square of its inner lining rested inside Lily's coat, hidden against the child's heart. Abby felt the room look at her size first. She had known it would. Some people looked quickly and looked away. Others let their eyes linger as if she were a question they had already answered. Caleb walked one step behind her, not ahead, not pulling her through shame like a rescued thing. Behind. Close enough that she could feel he was there. Lily walked on Abby's other side, her small hand brushing Abby's sleeve, but not taking hold until they reached the front bench. Judge Amos Bell looked over his spectacles. "Miss Whitaker." "Mr. Vale. We're here to void an unfinished marriage license and settle any public claim regarding the events of yesterday morning." Preston stood in his gray coat with his hair combed smooth and his expression injured just enough to look respectable. "Your Honor," he began, "I never intended harm. I was placed in an impossible position by a woman who misrepresented herself and then created a scene before the church." Abby folded her hands in her lap. Her palms were dry, but her fingertips felt cold. Judge Bell glanced at her. "Miss Whitaker, you will have your chance." Preston continued, voice gentle enough to sound rehearsed. "I tried to be charitable. Everyone in this room knows I agreed to marry beneath my station because I believed Miss Whitaker to be modest, grateful, and suited to a quiet household. But on the morning of the ceremony, she became difficult, emotional, demanding. When I hesitated, she chose to make a spectacle of herself." A murmur went through the benches. Abby did not look back. Caleb's boots shifted once on the wooden floor. He did not speak. Preston turned slightly, letting the room see his wounded dignity. A man has a right to reconsider when he finds the woman before him is not the woman he was promised. Judge Bell looked at Abby. "Miss Whitaker?" The room waited. Abby stood, and the bench gave a small creak behind her. She heard someone near the back whisper, "Poor thing." This time the words did not push her down. They passed through the air and fell somewhere behind her. "I did not misrepresent myself," Abby said. Her voice shook on the first word, then steadied. "I stood before Mr. Vale exactly as I am. I wore the dress I made. I brought the ring he gave me. I asked for nothing but the vows he had already promised." Preston sighed. "You asked for more than any man could reasonably carry." The judge frowned. "Mr. Vale, you will not interrupt." Abby kept her eyes on the judge. "He left me in the road because he was ashamed to be seen choosing me. That is the plain truth." Preston's smile vanished. No decent man would have enjoyed being forced into such an arrangement. Caleb's hands closed slowly around the back of the bench in front of him. Still, he said nothing. Abby felt him holding silence for her, not taking her voice. Preston lifted his chin. "Ask anyone." She ran after another man before the mud was even dry on her dress. Lily moved then. Small, sudden, determined. Abby reached for her, but the child had already stepped into the aisle. The whole room changed. Everyone knew that child. Everyone knew the silence wrapped around her like a locked door. Lily walked to the judge's table, reached inside her coat, and pulled out the folded square of white cloth. She placed it carefully on the polished wood. Judge Bell softened. "Miss Mercer, do you wish to show me something?" Lily nodded. Caleb went still behind Abby. The judge waited. No one breathed loudly. Lily touched the white cloth with one finger. It was clean in the center, but along one edge a faint brown stain remained, too stubborn for soap. When she finally spoke, her voice was small, rough from disuse, but clear enough to fill every corner of the room. She fixed what everyone stepped on. Abby's hand flew to her mouth. Caleb's face changed as if the ground had shifted under him. Lily looked at the judge, then at Preston, then back at Abby. She did not ask Papa to take her, the child said, each word careful as a stitch. I did. The courthouse went silent. Not the cruel silence from the churchyard. Not the waiting silence before gossip. This was the kind of silence that comes when truth enters a room and every lie has to make itself smaller. Judge Bell removed his spectacles and set them down. Preston's mouth opened, but nothing useful came out. The judge looked at him over the folded square of wedding cloth. Mr. Vale, he said slowly, why exactly did you leave this woman in the mud? Preston Vale looked at the folded square of white cloth as though it had been laid there to accuse him, and in a way, it had. The brown stain along the edge seemed small beneath the courthouse windows, but every person in that room knew what it meant. Rain. Mud. A woman left standing alone while decent folks watched and called it none of their business. Judge Bell waited, his hand resting beside the cloth. Mr. Vale, he repeated, answer the question. Preston adjusted his cuffs. His smile returned, thinner now, polished over anger. Your Honor, emotions are high because a child has spoken. That is touching, certainly. But it does not settle the matter of judgment. I left because Miss Whittaker proved unsuitable. A man should not be condemned for refusing a poor match. Abby stood very still. Lily had returned to her side and pressed close against her skirt, but Abby could feel the child trembling. Caleb saw it too. His eyes moved from Lily's hand to Preston's face, and the room seemed to lose a little air. Judge Bell frowned. Unsuitable in what manner? Preston gave a soft, careful laugh, inviting the room to understand without requiring him to say it plainly. Look at her, Judge. Look at the talk she brings. Look at the spectacle. I have a family name to consider. A business to protect. I could not tie myself to a woman who makes people whisper before she even enters a room. No one laughed this time. Abby felt the old sting rise, but it meant something different inside her now. Not shame. Not quite anger. A clear, quiet knowing. She was still standing. Preston was the one shrinking. Caleb stepped forward then, not fast, not loud. The floorboards gave one low sound beneath his boots. That is enough. Judge Bell turned. Mr. Mercer, unless you have testimony relevant to the license, sit down. Caleb removed his hat and held it against his chest. I have testimony relevant to the woman he is trying to bury with words. Preston's mouth tightened. This does not concern you. Caleb looked at him. You made it concern every person in this town when you left her in the road. Preston leaned forward. Careful, Mercer. You are not in a position to make enemies. Folks here know your ranch is carrying debt. The bank knows it better than most. You might want to think before you shelter strays you cannot afford to feed. A sharp murmur moved through the courthouse. Abby turned toward Caleb, startled. He did not look at her. His gaze stayed on Preston, steady as a fence line in winter. Preston saw the room listening and pressed on. A man with unpaid notes should not pretend to be a hero. Especially not over a woman another man already judged unfit. Lily's hand tightened around Abby's skirt. Abby reached down and covered it with her own. She expected Caleb to defend his ranch. She expected him to speak of money, land, cattle, proof. Instead, he turned to her. Not to the judge. Not to the town. To her. Abby, he said, and her name sounded different in that room, clean and unashamed. I cannot decide your life for you. I would not try. But you have a room at my house for as long as you choose. You have wages for honest work. You have a place at the table. And if someday you want more than that from me, it will be because you chose it, not because a town needed a tidy ending. Abby could not speak. The room blurred at the edges, not from tears exactly, but from the shock of being offered dignity before rescue. Caleb turned back to Preston. You said no decent man would take what you left behind. His voice dropped, quiet enough that every person leaned toward it. Then I will. Not because you left her. Because my daughter saw her worth before any of us had the sense to. Preston's face flushed. You are making a fool of yourself. No, Caleb said. I did that for 2 years every time I let grief make my house colder than it had to be. Lily looked up at him. His voice softened, but it carried. That woman walked into my kitchen and my child ate breakfast. She mended a sleeve and my daughter trusted her with the doll her mother made. She stood in this room while you measured her by whispers, and she did not bend. Caleb placed his hat on the bench beside him, freeing both hands as if he had just laid down the last thing he could hide behind. So hear me plain, Vale. She stays. Not under my pity. Not under my name. Under her own. And anyone who speaks of her like mud from this day forward can answer to the truth in this room. Judge Bell looked from Caleb to Preston, then to Abby. Miss Whittaker, he said, his voice gentler than before, do you wish this license voided? Abby lifted her chin. Yes, Your Honor. Then it is void. The gavel came down once. A clean sound. A final sound. Preston stood frozen, his polished dignity cracked through. Lily turned and wrapped both arms around Abby's waist. Abby held her first. Not Caleb. Not the promise of a future. The child. In that silent courthouse, with the town watching, Abby Whittaker finally felt the mud begin to dry and fall away. Spring came to Mercer Ranch slowly, not as a miracle, but as 100 small mercies arriving one at a time. Snow pulled back from the fence posts. Grass showed in thin green lines along the creek. The hens began laying again, and the kitchen window stayed open long enough each afternoon for the smell of bread to drift out across the yard. Abby remained first as the cook, because that was the work agreed upon. Then she became the woman Caleb asked about seed orders, because she remembered numbers better than he did. Then she became the one Jonah and the other hands came to when a shirt needed mending, a fever needed watching, or a birthday needed some quiet kindness hidden inside a pie. No one said she had become the heart of the ranch. Not at first. Hearts do not announce themselves. They simply keep things alive. Lily changed in the same slow way. She did not wake one morning full of words. She gave them carefully, like buttons from a small treasured box. Coffee, when Caleb poured salt instead of sugar by mistake. Blue, when Abby held up 2 ribbons. Stay, sometimes at night when the wind rose and old fear moved through the rafters. Each word stopped Caleb where he stood. Each word made Abby set one hand against the nearest solid thing until she could breathe normally again. The first time Lily laughed, it happened over flour. Abby had been rolling biscuit dough while Lily shaped scraps into tiny moons for Rose. Caleb came in carrying a split log under one arm, his hat crooked from the wind. He leaned against the doorframe to watch them, and Abby tried to brush flour from her cheek, only to leave a white streak across her nose. Lily stared at her, then at Caleb, then let out a sound so light and startled that it seemed to surprise the room before it surprised her. Caleb lowered the log slowly. Abby did not move. Lily laughed again, hiding her mouth behind both hands. Caleb turned his face toward the window, but Abby saw his shoulders change, saw grief loosen one careful notch. After that, the house no longer felt like it was holding its breath. Abby never returned to wearing the wedding dress. Late in May, she took it from the drawer, washed the last of the old mud as best she could, and cut the clean panels into kitchen curtains. Caleb found her sewing them at the table after supper, the white cloth spread beneath the lamplight. You sure about that? He asked. Abby ran her thumb along the seam. It was made for a home, she said. Just not the one I thought. He did not answer, but the next morning he hung the curtain rod himself, measuring twice, sanding the ends smooth so the fabric would not snag. By summer, Mercy Creek had learned to speak of Abby differently. Some still whispered, because some people would rather keep a cruel habit than learn a decent one. But others came to the ranch road with orders for bread, jars to trade, or children who wanted to stand near Lily and hear whether she might say something. Abby did not need the town to love her. That was the difference. She no longer stood waiting for their permission to be whole. One evening, When the sky was gold behind the ridge and supper dishes were drying by the stove, Caleb came into the kitchen with his hat in his hands. Abby looked up from kneading dough. "If a horse is loose, Mr. Mercer, I am covered in flour and unfit for chasing." "No horse," he said. His voice was steady, but his hands were not. Lily sat at the table with Rose in her lap, watching him with solemn interest. Caleb crossed the room and stopped beside the work table, close enough for Abby to see the place where sunlight caught silver in his dark hair. "I have offered you work," he said. "You earned more than I could pay. I offered you a room. You made it a home. I offered you a place at the table. Somehow, you gave one back to me." Abby's hands went still in the dough. Caleb looked at Lily, then back at Abby. "I am not asking because Mercy Creek saw me stand beside you. I am not asking because Lily chose you first, though she had better sense than I did. I am asking because when I come in from the fields, I look for the kitchen light before I look for anything else." Lily slid from her chair and came to Abby's side. Very softly she said, "Mama Abby." Abby closed her eyes. The words settled over her like warmth after a long winter. When she opened them, Caleb was waiting, the way he had waited the day she climbed into his wagon by her own strength. No pushing, no claiming, only a choice placed gently before her. Abby wiped her floury hands on her apron and reached for his. "Yes," she said. Outside, the ranch hands were coming in from the pasture, their voices low and tired. Inside, the stove glowed red, the white curtains moved in the evening breeze, and Lily pressed Rose between them as if the doll belonged to all three. People in town would always remember the day Abigail Whitaker stood in the mud. But at Mercer Ranch, Lily remembered it differently. She remembered it as the day she found her mother before her father found the courage to find love, and from then on, the house on the North